For years, Jamie Dornan mastered the art of silence. Whenever questions drifted toward marriage, children, or long-term plans, he deflected with humor or vague generalities. That strategy worked, until one unexpected moment changed everything. This time, he didn't dodge the question, and the room instantly felt different. The moment came during what was meant to be a routine exchange, a setting where no one expected a headline. When asked about his future, Jamie Dornan paused, then answered in a way that sounded deliberate rather than rehearsed. He didn't confirm anything outright, but he didn't shut the door either. In that brief response, many heard something they had never heard from him before: openness. What made the reaction so explosive was not what he said, but what he allowed to remain unsaid. Instead of retreating behind privacy, Jamie acknowledged that life plans evolve and that certain possibilities were no longer off the table. For an actor who had guarded his personal life with near obsession, that admission felt seismic. The silence he had maintained for years suddenly fractured. Within minutes, clips of the exchange spread online, dissected word by word. Fans replayed his tone, his hesitation, even the way he exhaled before speaking. Some interpreted it as a soft confirmation, others as a carefully measured concession. Either way, the message was clear: something had shifted. The speculation inevitably circled back to Dakota Johnson. Their connection had long been the subject of whispered rumors, but neither had ever fed them directly. Jamie's comment, however restrained, felt like the first time he acknowledged a shared future as a real concept. That alone was enough to reignite every dormant theory. Insiders suggested that the timing was not accidental. Jamie had reportedly grown tired of constant deflection, of being perceived as evasive or emotionally distant. Speaking honestly, even in fragments, may have felt more sustainable than endless avoidance. In that sense, breaking the silence wasn't about revelation, but relief. Still, the risks were obvious. Any mention of weddings or children in Hollywood quickly spirals beyond control. Jamie understood that a single sentence could redefine public perception overnight. The fact that he chose to speak anyway suggested a level of readiness he hadn't shown before. Observers noted that his demeanor during the exchange was unusually calm. There was no nervous laughter, no attempt to soften the moment with irony. Instead, he spoke slowly, choosing words with care, as if aware they would travel far beyond the room. That composure made the statement feel grounded, not impulsive. What followed was an immediate divide in interpretation. Some fans celebrated, convinced this was the clearest sign yet of long-term commitment. Others warned against reading too much into a deliberately vague response. Jamie's refusal to clarify only intensified both reactions. Behind the scenes, sources described a man navigating a delicate balance. He wanted to protect what mattered, but he also no longer wanted to pretend that questions about the future were irrelevant. Admitting that marriage and children were part of the conversation didn't mean an announcement was coming. It meant the conversation itself was real. By the end of the day, headlines had already framed the moment as a confession. Jamie Dornan had broken his silence, and the world rushed to fill in the blanks. Whether he intended it or not, the narrative had changed. Silence had once been his shield, but now it was his words, carefully chosen, that carried the weight. And that was the true turning point. Not a declaration, not a denial, but an acknowledgement that certain plans were no longer unthinkable. For someone who had spent years keeping those doors firmly closed, even a crack was enough to send shockwaves through the conversation. The reaction to Jamie Dornan's words didn't fade after the first wave of headlines. Instead, it settled into something heavier, more analytical, as observers began asking why now. For someone who had protected his private life so fiercely, timing mattered. The fact that he chose this moment suggested internal changes that had been building quietly for some time. Those close to Jamie Dornan described a gradual shift in priorities rather than a sudden decision. Over the past year, he had reportedly become more reflective, less dismissive of long-term conversations. Parenthood, stability, and emotional continuity were no longer abstract ideas but topics discussed seriously behind closed doors. Breaking the silence was not impulsive, but overdue. Much of the speculation inevitably focused on Dakota Johnson, even though she said nothing publicly. Her silence, however, carried its own weight. Unlike previous moments when rumors surfaced, this time there were no playful deflections or ironic remarks from her side. The absence of denial felt deliberate. Insiders suggested that Dakota had long been clear about her boundaries, especially when it came to public narratives. She preferred actions over statements and consistency over reassurance. If marriage and children were being discussed privately, there was no urgency for her to validate that publicly. Silence, in this case, functioned as control rather than avoidance. As the days passed, details from the inner circle began to shape a more nuanced picture. Jamie's comment wasn't meant to announce plans, but to acknowledge alignment. It signaled that the conversation between them had matured beyond hypotheticals. That distinction mattered more than any headline. There was also an emotional risk in speaking at all. Once such possibilities are mentioned, expectations follow, and expectations can become pressure. Jamie was aware that fans and media would attempt to map timelines and outcomes onto a single sentence. Accepting that risk implied a readiness to face speculation rather than hide from it. Observers noticed subtle behavioral shifts following the interview. Jamie appeared more relaxed in subsequent appearances, less guarded when questions drifted toward personal topics. He still didn't elaborate, but the tension that once accompanied those questions seemed to ease. It was as if acknowledging the future removed the need to constantly defend the present. At the same time, sources emphasized that acknowledging plans does not equal urgency. Marriage and children were not portrayed as immediate milestones, but as shared considerations. The distinction between someday and soon remained intentionally undefined. That ambiguity allowed space without committing to a narrative the public could fixate on. For Dakota, the situation reportedly reinforced her preference for privacy even further. She understood how quickly narratives form and how rarely they reflect reality. Allowing Jamie's words to exist without commentary preserved her autonomy. It ensured that whatever decisions were made would remain theirs first, not the public's. What made this moment resonate was not romance, but realism. Two people navigating a future under constant scrutiny must choose carefully when to speak. Jamie's choice to break silence didn't promise an outcome. It acknowledged a process already underway. By the end of the week, the conversation had shifted from speculation to reflection. Fans began recognizing that growth doesn't always arrive with announcements. Sometimes it appears as restraint, as measured honesty, as a single sentence allowed to stand without correction. That restraint gave Jamie's words their power. In the larger context, this was less about weddings or babies than about evolution. Jamie Dornan was no longer avoiding the future to protect the present. He was acknowledging that the future existed, and that it mattered. That acknowledgement alone marked a turning point. Whether plans would eventually become reality remained unknown. What was clear, however, was that silence had ceased to be his only defense. In choosing to speak carefully rather than not at all, Jamie reshaped the narrative around him. And in doing so, he signaled that some conversations, once unthinkable, were now firmly on the table. And in doing so, he signaled that some conversations, once unthinkable, were now firmly on the table.